Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our series, Soviet Montage of the 1920s, A New Cinema for a New Society. Today's film is a 1927 masterpiece by Vyacheslav Pudovkin, The End of St. Petersburg. It's a vast historical epic, but it also has a whole core of human experience through one protagonist. We'll be talking about that, the film's stunning editing technique, and more after today's screening. Joining us will be Dr. Anthony Anemany, a noted scholar of Russian literature and film. Now, take this journey into revolutionary Russia in 1917. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see a truly epic film, and a film made 100 years ago that feels so modern and is so extraordinary in its storytelling and its film technique. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's a pleasure to have back on CUNY TV, back here on City Cinematheque, a good friend, Dr. Anthony Anemany, Tony, who is an emeritus professor of Russian literature, film, and cultural history at the New School, and he has thought about and written widely about many of the issues that pertain to this film. Welcome back, Tony.
Thanks very much, Jerry. Glad to be back.
Great, great. So this is Pudovkin's second feature film. The previous feature film had been Mother, which we included in this series. Kind of bring us up to speed. Who's Pudovkin when he's making this film? Where's he coming from?
So it's an interesting story. He is a member of the first generation of filmmakers after the revolution. He was a child of peasants from Central Russia. He served in World War I, was captured by the Germans, and spent several years in prison camp. And when he came back to already Soviet Russia in 1918, he went and he decided that cinema was his thing. So he went and he studied at the first cinema school in Moscow, where he met and worked with a number of the leading directors of the time, most notably Lev Kuleshov. And worked with them on several films, and he had a sort of a broad education. He worked as an art director, he acted in a number of films, he was an assistant director, and he did all of this before he finished and before he started working himself. So he's a man of the people, but he's educated in sort of modern cinema, and he's being taught by the masters of montage theory, people who are deeply engaged in the process. Perhaps it's not correct to say masters of the theory, because these are the people who are developing these theories at the time that Pudovkin is a student. And he instantly puts what he's learned into practice and makes movies shortly after he finishes school.
Right, and it's also the case that he then becomes one of those theorists himself. And I remember, myself when I was at university on the student side as opposed to the professor's side, you could find the English translation of his book, which is very important in film education in the United States, because it was one of the books that talked about what the theory of editing itself was, and in contradistinction to many of the pronouncements made by his colleague in Soviet montage, Sergei Eisenstein.
Right. So you're absolutely right. He is one of the first theorists, but it's interesting, that entire generation, they all wrote a lot. Yeah. Eisenstein wrote an amazing amount. Dovzhenko became an important teacher for years, and as you say, a theorist. Kuleshov wrote about what they were doing, and I think it was natural for these people, since they were working out new theories of how to make movies, how to tell stories narratively with images, and so they all took to writing very easily. One other thing that might be mentioned about Pudovkin is that he was a member of the Communist Party at an early age, and as his this comes back to perhaps to sort of he runs into some problems in the 1930s, and partly and one of the things that he's doing, in a sense, is that he becomes more of a teacher and more a writer than a filmmaker. The difficulties of the Stalinist period,
Right.
very hard for all of the great filmmakers. But the period that we're talking about, the mid-1920s, are the absolute height, not only of Soviet early cinema, silent cinema in general, but also of his work. So it's a wonderful period to be talking about.
Right, right. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that he is himself a person of actually peasant stock origin. And in a certain sense, he's one of those people who becomes an extraordinary beneficiary of the revolution, because that is one of the promises of the revolution. And it's actually one of the promises, made, if not fully rendered, in the film itself. So let's talk about how he handles character and what he wants to do with characters in this film.
Right. So that's exactly right. I mean, social mobility was, in fact, a central promise of the revolution. And as you say, his life exemplifies that. Something we were talking about before we started screening is the notion of sort of conversion movies. And literally, his first 3 movies are all about conversions. And in a sense, he was converted through history, through his experiences, and his movies are all about people who also change completely over the course of the movie. And that is one of the, that is a pure sort of revolutionary method. It's not a political message, but it is a message about revolution and the revolution in Russian life, which for Pudovkin is always about individuals. It's about psychology. It's about life, and it's not necessarily or not narrowly about politics, as you might see. And over years, you will increasingly become one of the central messages of socialist realist cinema. But in this period, you can see transformation and revolution as a theme that is not narrowly political.
Right, and it's very interesting that, of course, he takes someone who is of extraordinary naivete, but is also highly representative, because I think it's worth just remembering that at the time the revolution takes place in 1917, the level of poverty, as shown in the film, but also the simple illiteracy of the vast population is there. So it's very important that you have a protagonist who comes from that side of things, not only from poverty, but from how does he learn things. He learns through experience. He does not learn by going to the library.
Right, right.
He does not learn from Marxist theory. The conversion is an experiential conversion, and for my money, Pudovkin is just utterly brilliant at immersing us in that experience of the characters, but particularly of our male
Right. It's an interesting way that he does it, because his characters are usually, they're often not named. In this movie, the characters don't really have names. So on some level, they're clearly representative of their class.
Right.
Or I should say, but Pudovkin is able to invest characters with a personal psychology, with a background, with a life, while at the same time showing them as clear representatives of a class. So you have this movement back and forth, effortless in the cinema, I think, between a character as a poor peasant and this particular peasant, this person who's lost his family, who has been forced out to find a job, who by accident sort of hits on a certain path and continues on it. So there's a sense of agency and also a sense of symbolism, which is extremely difficult to realize in the cinema, and it's one of Pudovkin's strong points.
No, and it's also one of the reasons when the statement can be made about all of these films. Why they're propaganda films, and you want to say, well, yeah, that's like observing that water is wet. That's why they were really made. But the point is that they're not all about revolutionary ideas, as you were saying, although that much of that is embedded in them. What I think you're pointing towards is this incredible balancing act that he has between this particularity of the character and how that can be created cinematically, that we can have this a relationship, particularly with that character, but also, with the mother. The final scenes in the film of the charity, of giving the potatoes out, et cetera, but also just the notion of when she's caressing the wounded young man. We're immersed in a purely human experience that is not, that may serve ideology, but is not exclusively ideological.
Right. The film is, I think that's all correct. And one of the things that's interesting about the film is the way that Pudovkin is explicit about the kind of ethical need or the ethical desire for transformation or revolution, if you like. They use the phrase a couple of times, search for truth. When the young peasant man, the naive peasant, thinks that he's going to have the authorities arrest the troublemaker, the Bolshevik troublemaker, when they're talking about plans for the strike, his countryman is arrested, and the peasant is horrified by this. He doesn't understand what's going on here, so he goes to the boss, and he basically says, "My guy was not involved," and he says, "I'm going to seek justice," right. And that is is a kind of semi-comic, semi-tragic sort of moment in his life. Yes. But it underlies the message of the entire film. That is justice is being trampled upon in this world, and that sort of feeds all of the filming of the bosses and the right. police and the soldiers and the frenzied stock market buyers and sellers. All of that is in service to the larger sort of what I call a kind of ethical Marxism, a sense that in this class society there is deep and profound injustice right. that has to be changed. And this movie is all about that urge for justice, and it's also about the sort of the complexities of searching for it, finding it, making errors, and coming to a sort of a truth. And as you've mentioned before, the truth, he finally understands the truth of the situation through his own experiences in prison, in the army, during World War I, and then the post-war situation, where the war is still going on and there are different factions in, right. in society. Some who say we need to stop the war, and the new government wants to fight the war to a victorious conclusion. And he makes a decision at that point that he is to end the war. And that kind of sets in motion the ending of the movie. And of course, that's what sets in motion the revolution from the viewpoint right. of the filmmaker. So it's not your kind of classic Leninist sort of movie, or movie of where you would, or political movie, where if you look at Eisenstein's October, for example,
which will be screening in the series.
Right. Well, remember this for when you do screen this movie. The revolution is the work of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. Wow. Yeah. And that's not a particularly Marxist viewpoint. Marx believes in more sort of social inevitability and social development, right? But Eisenstein takes that in a very specific, very narrowly political point of view. Pudovkin is all about creating the historical, social reasons for revolution, and the Bolsheviks are not really, they're not really part of it. And that's also, I think, an unusual, or it's an important contrast between Pudovkin and his great competitor and often friend, Sergei Eisenstein. There's no cult of personality right. in Pudovkin, whereas Eisenstein essentially is the great creator, or one of the great contributors to this notion of a cult of personality. For Eisenstein, it was mostly Lenin, but of course it's easy to transfer this from Lenin to Stalin over time. So there's one could look at early Russian cinema, early post-revolutionary Russian cinema, precisely through this lens of right. Pudovkin and his view of where revolution comes from versus Eisenstein's view. And I personally find Pudovkin's view much more acceptable, much more interesting as a cinematic and as a historical right. sort of point.
Well, I'm going to take that in two different directions. First of all, Eisenstein wrote a very famous essay, Mr. Lincoln by Mr. Ford, because of his admiration for John Ford's young Mr. Lincoln, an extraordinarily well-crafted film. But that sort of underlines your point in that there is a great man of history theory there the great leader that needs a hagiographic treatment.
Right.
You know, that oh, there is a myth, but there was a man there, but the myth is very, very important, and in a certain sense, we must worship that myth. And so, you know, Eisenstein sees that Ford is doing the same thing for Lincoln that he was doing for Alexander Nevsky.
Right. Right.
Whereas if I'm going to make the American analogy, Pudovkin's much more the Frank Capra kind of guy, where he's very interested in this whole notion of the people and the people seeking justice in the ways that you have outlined in this in what you just said.
Well, I like the Frank Capra analogy especially because Pudovkin is also funny.
Okay, good point.
He has a sense of humor that goes far beyond the sort of biting satirical laughter that you'll often experience it in this movie as well.
It's for sure.
But that's all over the place in Eisenstein. He's making fun of the enemy and
Right.
the bourgeoisie.
It's much more satiric than comic.
Right. And if you see, if you watch Pudovkin's first movie, a short called Chess Fever,
Please, tell us about it.
You will see one of the great moments of 1920s comedy, physical comedy, joyful. It is a movie that is in many ways, you could compare it to Frank Capra quite easily. There's no particular political theme. There's nothing in it but the joy of making a film and making people laugh. It's the sort of film that is impossible to imagine Eisenstein, the mature Eisenstein, making. So that is interesting. And as you point out, Eisenstein and Alexander Nevsky, the rest of his career was, of course, doing Ivan the Terrible. So there is this turn to biography, to cult of personality in the historical sort of sphere. With obvious relevance for the development of the Soviet Union. And even though Eisenstein was clearly critical of Ivan the Terrible,
right.
It's a rather complicated relationship between those two.
Well, this brings up the larger point of the fact that we sometimes forget, or we have to look into our historical record, that if there was a single school of filmmaking that influenced the Soviet montage people, it was actually American cinema.
Yes.
Because they deeply admired what D.W. Griffith had done. They deeply admired, there's a particular film called Tolerable David by Henry King, which they thought was a model of rhythmic editing and of parallel editing. And just to come back to your point, they also very much liked American silent comedy.
Right.
And one of the ways that fits, I think, with Pudovkin, at just like one little level of abstraction above it, is that they wanted a transfer of energy. They saw in these American films not only great technique, but I think they saw a cultural energy there. Now, they may not have agreed that it came out of a capitalist society, but one of the things that they then developed their technique is, how can we get people on the side of what we're doing to understand that they need to put, and this was a huge need of the revolutionary society, join us, not just join us, don't just sign up, join us enthusiastically and put all your energy, like these people that we show as being converted in the film. They're not only invested in an idea, they're investing in a project that is going to take all of their energy to move forward.
Well, this idea of early Soviet comedy is a central issue, and it's a real struggle to get comedy into Soviet cinema.
Right. Yeah.
The notion is that this is a serious art, this should have political ramifications, and comedy can undercut that. Pudovkin acted when he was a couple of years before his films. He acted in the greatest 1920s comedy in Soviet Russia, The Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks, by his mentor and teacher, Lev Kuleshov. And he does play this melodramatic, very funny role also. So this is clearly a background to him. And you're absolutely right about the importance of American cinema. Chaplin is another person
Yes.
who has to be mentioned here. And in fact, Chess Fever is a takeoff on a Chaplin type of a
Right.
movie, and the main character is a kind of tramp character. But it's brilliantly done, and it's brilliantly adapted to this different world of early Soviet Russia. So that is I think a fascinating element to these movies that needs to be remembered.
Great. Well, let's go back to that word that's in the title of this set of films that I've curated, and that is montage.
Right.
So everybody agrees Pudovkin and Eisenstein are both montage filmmakers, but they have different ideas about what montage is, and they both want to build films out of shots.
Right.
They're not, I mean, they may have great actors, but they're not capturing performance. They're constructing a film. But what are their different ideas about that? And why does a Pudovkin film, in a certain sense, feel different? Because he has a different idea of how to assemble shots.
Right. So that's, that is another of these questions that I think gets to the heart of the complexity of Soviet cinema in the 1920s that is often ignored. A couple of things I would say. If you look at this film by Pudovkin, for example, what you will see, and you sort of make a list of all of the various montage techniques. You will see the parallel editing. You will see iris effects. You will see the director using a montage shot in order to tell you what the character is thinking of. The character will think. You'll see an image. You'll move back to the character. You'll see double images. You'll see the very rapid edits in order to express emotion or violence or disruption, all that kind of stuff. Everything that you'll see in Eisenstein, you will see in Pudovkin. One of the major differences, though, I think, is that Pudovkin really is able to use montage in the interests of the larger story, whereas Eisenstein, well, I should say also that he also uses it in a way to elicit emotions from the viewer. And they're the basic emotions of pity, of outrage, of sorrow, nothing particularly fancy, but he will do that throughout. And there's a real economy to the way he does it. He doesn't overdo it. He will give you enough to make his point, and he'll move on and tell the story. Eisenstein, you get the sense, is always trying to do more. He's sort of I would say over-intellectualized the process, and he has created films that are so complicated in his use of montage that it has provided fodder for critics and professors for generations to play with. Pudovkin is by contrast transparent in that sense. And I think that in the sort of efficiency and the transparency and the directness of Pudovkin's approach, there is something that is more accessible to viewers. Professors will always prefer Eisenstein because there's much more to write about. But from the point of view of a movie, of an ordinary movie viewer, I think that there's a real advantage to Pudovkin. It's hard to talk about the way audiences reacted to these movies in the 20s. It's a complicated story.
Right.
Many of the movies were not released widely. There weren't movie theaters in much of the country. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to discuss that. But when one looks at it today, one can really see it's kind of a paradox. You see two filmmakers using almost the exact same techniques. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are many sequences which look like they come from each other's movies. Right. Yet there is an absolute difference in the way they develop those things within the movies. So I think that's perhaps the most important and obvious difference between them.
Well, and I may be oversimplifying here, and that's easy to do in the case of such complicated artists. But there's a way in which Pudovkin always gives priority to the human story at the core, while at the same time introducing framing of larger societal issues, things that you can call ideology, you can call it politics, but there is that notion of a dominant organizing aesthetic, and the story of injustice and conversion to the right side of that takes that. And then just following to you, there's always a notion that maybe the ideas are more interesting to Eisenstein than the people, you know, much less individual characters, because he's aside from his great men of history, he's not so much interested in individuals. Whereas, you know, the bearers of all of this, of the story for Pudovkin, need to be the story.
Right.
They need to be there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit with this notion of sort of Pudovkin's interest in individual psychology, and somehow he's able to do both social psychology and individual psychology. I'm not sure exactly how he does it, but he does it. And Eisenstein, as you say, is not really interested in individuals. Every individual in Eisenstein is a symbol. And even when there are similarities between, for example, the woman in Eisenstein's Old and the New. It's a conversion story about a peasant turning into a kind of convinced socialist or communist, which is what you have in Pudovkin's Mother. But again, the character doesn't feel like a real person. Right. The character always feels like a symbol of the peasant class as a whole. So that doesn't, that I think is really there.
I think it's an appropriate moment for us, not only because we're running out of time, but also because we are actually, setting up this fact that you can have an umbrella term like Soviet montage, but when you look underneath the umbrella, you find that there's a really interesting entanglements of relationships, sometimes of friendship, sometimes, sometimes of opposition, but the aesthetic is not always the same thing with the different practitioners, even though their revolutionary goals may be shared. So that's where we're going to land today.
It's an absolutely good point to remind us all of.
Okay, great. If you'd like to know more about City Cinematheque, or more generally about CUNY TV, please go to our website, www.tv.cuny.edu. And there's a special treat if you go there. You'll be able to find out how to get our really cool and neat new app so you can stream CUNY TV wherever you are. So please visit www.tv.cuny.edu and get that CUNY TV app. Tony, always a pleasure to listen to your expertise and to have the chance to chat about work so interesting as these.
Thank you very much, Jerry. So, as usual, it's a pleasure for me as well.
Great. And thank you for joining us here today on City Cinematheque. And please join us again in the future as we continue our strolls through the archives of film history. Bye for now.